one of the country's most prominent financiers, is scheduled to appear in a New York State courtroom today to face charges of sex trafficking.
Jeffrey Epstein has long faced accusations of molesting young girls and pleaded guilty to lesser charges more than a decade ago in Florida. But until now, the billionaire hedge fund manager has avoided federal charges. Epstein was arrested on Saturday when his private plane landed in New Jersey. The full details of the charges against him will be unsealed later today.
NPR Justice correspondent Carrie Johnson is with us this morning to talk about this case. Hey, Carrie.
Hey, Rachel.
First off, what more do we know, if anything, about the nature of the charges against Epstein? I mean, we said the words sex trafficking.
Yeah, one of my sources in law enforcement says the charges are sex trafficking related. We don't have more specifics at this time. We'll learn more later today. The CBS station in Miami, Florida reports there are going to be 2 charges, sex trafficking and conspiracy. We do know Epstein was taken into custody this weekend after his plane landed after an international flight. He'd apparently been in Paris for a while. And we also know that Jeffrey Epstein is due in court in New York City later today in federal court, where there's going to be a back and forth about whether he can be released on bond. Of course, Jeffrey Epstein has a lot of financial resources, and these federal prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office may argue that he presents a flight risk if he's released on bond.
So some people will know his name from recent headlines, but a lot of people won't. Remind us who he is.
Yeah, he's often described in a nutshell as a billionaire money man or hedge fund manager. People who know him tell me he's brilliant and secretive. Over the years, Epstein has developed ties to a bunch of prominent people. People like former President Bill Clinton, current President Donald Trump, and lawyer Alan Dershowitz. Epstein avoided federal charges more than 10 years ago. Instead, at that time, he took a state plea in Florida to prostitution charges. Now, that plea deal has been criticized as too lenient. For one thing, authorities actually let him out of jail nearly every day to go to work managing money. And the federal prosecutor who helped arrange that deal is now the current Secretary of Labor, Alex Acosta. Justice Department watchdogs right now are investigating that old plea deal and the Justice Department's role in it.
So what is happening now? I mean, these allegations have been around for years. Why is it resurfacing? Are these new charges? Are these the same old charges?
You know, there were important stories at the time in publications like Vanity Fair, which reported that Epstein was allegedly coercing underage girls into sex acts with him and others. But the atmosphere has changed a lot since 2007 and 2008. It's now the Me Too era, where a lot more attention is being paid to survivors of sexual abuse. And actually, really importantly, the Miami Herald resurfaced these allegations in a big investigation and found what it calls a lot of new victims of Epstein recently. It's not clear whether these new charges to be unsealed today include a lot of new victims and new conduct in New York City, or whether some of the conduct overlaps the guilty plea. Of course, his defense lawyers are going to really challenge anything that may overlap that old guilty plea.
Are you hearing anything from Epstein or his lawyers?
According to a federal prison database, Epstein spent the weekend at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, locked up. Not the nicest place to be. I reached out to Epstein's lawyer, Martin Weinberg. Haven't heard anything back so far. They may want to do their talking in court later today.
NPR's Carrie Johnson. Thanks, Carrie. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, what happens when one party to a deal violates the rules, not once, but twice?
Iran has announced it exceeded a second uranium enrichment limit that is outlined in a 2015 nuclear deal. This move comes a little more than a year after the Trump administration pulled out of the deal and reimposed sanctions that the United States had promised to lift as part of the agreement. Now Iran says it has the right to scale back on some of its commitments.
Peter Kenyon has been following the story. Joins us now from Vienna, Austria, which is significant because it is home of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors all of this stuff. Peter, can you start by just explaining the details of what Iran announced over the weekend?
Sure. Iran is now enriching uranium beyond the limit of just under 4%. That's what's laid out in the nuclear agreement. Now, that comes on top of its first breach of the deal a couple months ago. So now we have Iran stockpiling too much low-enriched uranium and enriching it beyond what the deal permits.
So, I mean, we should just ask. I mean, the concern here is that Iran is getting ever closer to being able to develop a nuclear bomb. Is that what this signifies, that they are closer?
Well, closer by a few inches, perhaps. Judging by these two steps alone, not very much closer. Iran's being a bit coy about just how high it might enrich the uranium at this point. But the experts I spoke with say if it's a small rise, as some Iranian officials have mentioned, to about 5%, say, that doesn't really get Iran much closer to weapons grade. That would be 90% enriched uranium. But the point is, this is no longer a single event. Now it's a trend, and it's not going in the right direction.
So let's talk about the motives here. I mean, Iran says that this is coming in response to the Trump administration's sanctions, what the Trump administration calls its maximum pressure campaign. But what is the American goal? I mean, presumably they want to get Iran back to the negotiating table, but what do they want to be in a more comprehensive nuclear deal?
Oh, they've got quite a list. I mean, Trump attacked the nuclear deal as too short, too time limited, not tough enough on Iran. The question's always been, as you say, now that he's pulled the U.S. out of the deal, what's he going to replace it with? And how will he get Iran to the table? Among things the White House wants to negotiate are Iran's support for terrorist groups in the region, the fate of people being held by the regime, what they call its malign behavior in the region in general. But the question still remains whether unilateral pressure without the other allies can accomplish that.
Right, because it hasn't worked up until now. So Iran says because the U.S. didn't keep its end of the bargain, they don't have to either. But the Europeans are obviously involved in this too. They are still technically signatories to this deal. What's their move in this moment?
Yeah, they're feeling the squeeze. All three European signatories to this deal, that's Germany, France, and Britain, are now publicly calling on Iran, hey, stop these violations, get back in line with the limits under the agreement. Because at the moment, you've still got, in the big picture, Europe, Russia, and China siding with Iran, leaving Washington alone with the desire to scrap this deal. But the more Iran violates the agreement itself, the more difficult Europe's position becomes.
What's next as you look to events? What would this decision trigger?
Well, more possible violations by Iran. I mean, a former IAEA legal advisor told me that the worst case would be if they walk out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which would be a step toward acquiring weapons. That doesn't seem likely. But they could do things like enriching faster, using more centrifuges, or increasing it up to 20%. That would really be alarming.
NPR's Peter Kenyon. Thanks, Peter. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Rachel.
The earth may keep quaking in California this week.
The U.S. Geological Survey says aftershocks are expected in days to come. 2 earthquakes, you may recall, struck in recent days. The first of them, a 6.4 magnitude quake on the 4th of July. Then, the next night, a second quake measured 7.1. The epicenter was about 2 hours north of Los Angeles. People felt the shaking at Disneyland and at Dodger Stadium. Nobody was seriously injured, and the infrastructure damage was relatively minor. But Governor Gavin Newsom says everyone should remain vigilant.
You got to be prepared. This is a wake-up call, not for this community. It's reality for this community, but it is a wake-up call for the rest of the state and for other parts of the nation that are not immune from this same kind of activity.
NPR's Eric Westervelt is in Ridgecrest, and he joins us now. So, Eric, no major injuries, which is a really obviously great thing, but the city has faced a series of aftershocks already. More are expected. What have people been telling you?
Yeah, good morning, Rachel. I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag because everyone you talk to is super thankful these quakes didn't do more damage. I mean, water and power are back up and running. Bus service resumes. The hospital is working. Public works crews have been repairing, the few roads that were damaged, doing some patching and sealing. The community, there's a sense they've really pulled together. I was at a forum last night where the mayor and other politicians, got a standing ovation, not just the first responders, the politicians. That doesn't happen every day. At the same time, people are pretty stressed out. I mean, by these aftershocks. Some have had trouble sleeping. It can be unnerving. I spoke to a woman named Cheryl Smallwood.
Well, I've been a little on edge. Out of all the years I've lived here, never been through one this big. I worry about my kids. I have 2 little ones. I hope that this never happens again, but I don't control that.
The Red Cross and county officials have brought in some counselors and some therapy dogs. They were a big hit with with kids. And officials, Rachel, are sort of encouraging people, take a break, try to relax, and acknowledge that this has been a really stressful holiday weekend for people here in Ridgecrest.
Right. So some roadways buckled, I understand. There were cracks in some roads. Some gas lines broke, sparking a few fires. What else have you seen? I mean, we've talked about the fact that the dam could have been so much worse.
Yeah, those visible signs are pretty much repaired. When you drive through the city, excuse me, besides a few traffic lights out, there's really no visible signs that this massive quake, a 7.1, hit recently. But when you do talk to people, they say, look, the interiors of our homes were pretty roughed up. I talked to a woman who said she came home from vacation and her upright piano had been toppled, mirrors smashed, glass everywhere. But even she is very grateful that, things weren't more destroyed and that the town is in the shape it's in. People here have a kind of keep calm and carry on attitude.
Yeah, but this isn't a very populated area where you are and where this hit. Presumably, if this had happened in a more urban area, we'd be talking about a different kind of story.
Absolutely, talking about a very different story. And I think everyone here from the governor on down are saying this is a wake-up call to get your, personal kit for a quake ready and be ready for the next one.
And there's Eric Westervelt reporting for us this morning. Thanks, Eric.
You're welcome.
A simple description of the allegations by federal prosecutor Jeffrey Berman is devastating to hear.
The charges allege that Epstein sexually abused young girls by enticing them to engage in sex acts for money.
The prosecutor is referring to the financier Jeffrey Epstein. He pleaded not guilty to those charges in court Monday. Epstein, though, pleaded guilty to lesser charges in the state of Florida back in 2008. That was part of a plea deal, which protected him from major jail time.
How much do we understand now of the case against Epstein, and how much more is yet to be learned? NPR's Quill Lawrence is on the line from New York. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Steve.
According to prosecutors, how large was this conspiracy?
Well, the indictment they unsealed is only covering a period of 3 years, and that was 15 years ago. But they clearly think that there are more victims and that Epstein sort of continued this pattern of behavior, that he recruited a network of young girls who would then bring in other young girls for money to give him these nude massages, which turned into sexual abuse. Here's Special Agent Bill Sweeney talking about the impact of these crimes.
Those who have been victimized by child sexual predators are frequently haunted by memories of these crimes well into their adulthood, often for the rest of their lives. They bear the burden of someone else's criminal behavior.
Quill, we were reading yesterday this indictment that referred to dozens of victims, and then after hearing of dozens of victims, it's really quite sobering to hear the prosecutor say, we don't even know how many more of you there may be. If you think you're a victim, call this 800 number.
Yeah, the most dramatic part for me of that press conference yesterday was that they put up a picture of Epstein and they said, if you have seen this man, if you think you've been harmed by this man, call this FBI 800 number. So they think that this behavior went on for years and years, and there must be many more victims. And they found, after arresting him, when he landed at this New Jersey airport, they found they've got a warrant to break into his home, his mansion in the Upper East Side, Manhattan, and they found, they said, a trove of nude photographs, which they believe are underage girls. So that's also, I would imagine, as child pornography charges on top of the other charges.
Other than entering a not guilty plea, have you heard anything from Epstein's side about how he would say he is not guilty of these charges?
Only that he's retained a high-powered law firm. We don't know. He said he's not guilty, and there's a bail hearing on Thursday.
We've also heard that Epstein is very, very well connected, which has forced some very prominent people to make statements about their links to him.
Yes, the office of former President Bill Clinton, it sort of detailed the times that they were together and said that it was all accompanied by Secret Service and that he knew nothing of Epstein's terrible crimes, he said. President Trump hasn't said anything, although in the past he had said that Epstein was a fun guy who seemed to like younger women. Alex Acosta, who's President Trump's Secretary of Labor, had signed off on this plea deal in Florida, which allowed him to escape prison time. But what we're looking for next really is whether he will have a chance at bail. Epstein has a private jet. He landed in New Jersey from Paris on Saturday in this private jet, and the prosecutors are saying that he's just so powerful and wealthy, and that he's an extreme flight risk, and he should remain in detention throughout trial.
Quill, thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. Have a good morning.
That's NPR's Quill Lawrence. Some other news now. Hong Kong's chief executive says she is giving up on an extradition bill. It's an apparent victory for protesters who pushed her back even though the rules were heavily against them.
Her name is Carrie Lam, and she had previously suspended this measure. Protesters, though, weren't satisfied. So now she says the bill is dead, though she still hasn't formally withdrawn it. Her latest step is another win for protesters who have faced long odds in all this. Under China's complicated system for controlling Hong Kong, Carrie Lam is not really elected by the people. She's chosen under a system that's dominated by Beijing. In the end, though, protesters forced the chief executive to answer to them.
Does her latest move really end this story? Let's ask NPR's Julie McCarthy, who's been covering the tales. She joins us now from Manila. Hi there, Julie.
Hi.
How significant is this statement by Carrie Lam?
Well, I have to say, taken as a whole, it sounds like a kinder, gentler way of saying no to the protesters and their demands. And this in the face of the biggest challenge to the Beijing-controlled Hong Kong government in decades. Lam sounds like she's trying to stop the turmoil, which she even admits her government started when it pushed this extradition measure. And here's what she said today about the fate of that bill, recognizing that there is a problem.
There are still lingering doubts about the government's sincerity, or worries whether the government will restart the process in the Legislative Council. So I reiterate here, there is no such plan. The bill is dead.
Julie, help me understand a thing you said there. Listening to the entirety of her statement, you felt that in some way she's also pushing back on the protesters and trying to reject some of their demands. What do you mean by that?
Well, it sounds like it's an unambiguous statement, but there's a lot of semantics involved here, especially for the protesters. The demonstrator said today the word dead or suspending the bill, in other terms she's used, has no legal meaning in the Legislative Council, Hong Kong's parliament. Withdrawal does, so use it. She won't. Instead, when she spoke in Cantonese, she used the word, she used an idiom that means to die in one's bed at a ripe old age. And the implication is that this bill will not be revived in this session and therefore would simply die at the start of next year. Now, protesters say, if you're sincere, why the aversion to withdrawing it now? And, beyond the bill, she's rejected all of their other demands today.
Okay, so we should think of this as another half step back, not a complete capitulation to the protesters. And you said other demands. What other demands do the protesters make to Carrie Lam?
Well, the demonstrators want amnesty for the protesters who've been arrested. Lam says no. The Department of Justice has got to take its course with no intervention. Demonstrators want authorities to retract the word riot to describe the protests. She says, I don't refer to the protesters that way. And the demonstrators demand an independent inquiry into allegations that the police used excessive force. Lam says a fact-finding by the Police Complaints Commission can do that. Demonstrators say, no, they can't. That binds all witnesses.
And I guess there was also a demand that Carrie Lam herself resign. She gave no indication she's doing that, did she?
No, she did not, and that's not likely to happen. She may at some point be recalled by Beijing, which is watching this very carefully. She's under a great deal of pressure from China to rein in the social upheaval.
Julie, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Julie McCarthy. Hey, the Affordable Care Act is on trial today, again.
Yeah, the case is Texas versus the United States, and it's yet another lawsuit meant to overturn President Obama's signature law. It is nearly a decade old at this point, and it survived two previous challenges that ended up in the Supreme Court. Today's hearing is in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans.
On the line now from New Orleans is Noam Levy of the LA Times, who's covering the trial. Good morning.
Good morning.
How does this suit differ from other legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act, the many other legal challenges?
Well, the crux of this case, which is different than the two other ones that have come before the Supreme Court to some extent, is the requirement that Americans have health insurance. That was what brought about the first suit against the Affordable Care Act, but now there is no more penalty on Americans who have health insurance. And so Texas and a group of other mainly Republican-led states, have sued saying without the mandate, you can't have the rest of the Affordable Care Act.
Let me just make sure I figure this out, because, I mean, there has been news about this in a lower court ruling, but I want to review it because it's quite remarkable. There was a mandate that was characterized, that was upheld by the Supreme Court because it was a tax. The federal government could use its taxing authority to penalize you if you did not have health insurance. Then the mandate was thrown out by Congress, and so now the argument is that without the tax penalty, there is no authority under Congress to mandate health insurance for people. Is that right?
That's right. And then the additional piece here, which is so important to this case in New Orleans, is that the states suing here are arguing that because that penalty, that tax penalty, was so critical to the Affordable Care Act program for extending health insurance, for guaranteeing sick people could get health insurance, for expanding Medicaid, so critical to all the reforms in the Affordable Care Act, that if you get rid of that penalty, you got to take the whole law down with it.
Let's hypothetically say the appeals court would agree to that, and ultimately maybe the Supreme Court would agree to that. What would it mean for a law that's now almost a decade old to just be completely obliterated from the books? Does anybody have any idea what that would look like?
I mean, it's hard to even imagine how disruptive that would be to the American healthcare system. So I think people probably understand at this point that the Affordable Care Act is responsible for extending health insurance coverage to some 20 million previously uninsured Americans. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. The law has now, as you said, been in place almost a decade. It now guarantees coverage. People have been used to getting coverage if they are sick. Without that guarantee, presumably insurers could go back to denying coverage to people who are sick. 20 some odd million people who have health insurance would lose it.
Is the court in a situation where it could even consider the consequences of this? Can they say this would be an utterly absurd ruling and therefore we can't make it? Or do they simply have to say, if they decide they agree with the plaintiffs in this, the law is what the law is, and let the chips fall where they may?
Well, this is just the next step in this lawsuit's journey. So this court can weigh in however it sees fit, and then of course we would expect that it may end up once again before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Noam Levy, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
He writes about national health care policy for the Los Angeles Times.
And all this week, I have been walking back and forth across the border between the United States and Mexico. We're here at a time when this country's approach to migration is changing. There's no more wall than there used to be, even though President Trump says otherwise. But what has changed is that some people seeking asylum in the U.S. are now being told to wait in Mexico. And we're down here learning how that policy is changing people's lives.
Well, Noel, my first question is whether that policy would be a reason why the number of migrants reaching the United States seems to have dropped a little lately.
Yeah, authorities tell us it is part of one reason. Migration, Steve, always goes down in the summer, as you know, because it is just unbearably hot,
Yeah.
So fewer people decide to make the journey. But important to note, there's also been increased enforcement, a crackdown essentially on the Mexican side of the border. And then there's this Trump administration policy called the Migrant Protection Protocols Initiative. Most people just call it Remain in Mexico.
How's it work?
All right, let's say you are looking to get asylum in the U.S. Back in the day, in the past, you'd cross the border and you'd say, I had to leave my home country. I'm in danger for X reason. And you would be given a court date and you'd wait in the United States until your court date. Remain in Mexico changes that. Now you get to the U.S. and you are sent back over the border to wait in Mexico for your day in a U.S. court. Now, this is happening to thousands of people. I'm right across the border from Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. Over 7,000 people have been dropped off there, sometimes in the middle of the night with no money and nowhere to go. It is really, really unpleasant.
And you can see what the purpose of the Trump administration is here, or one purpose anyway. They argue that letting people into the United States to wait for a court date gives them an incentive just to come, whether they have a good reason or not. That's their case. So they make them wait in Juarez. What do you see when you go there?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, I've been talking to people who've been sent back. I went to a homeless shelter where a lot of these people are staying. They have no place else to go. It's on the outskirts of Juarez. It's in the desert. There's this cluster of little yellow buildings. So I walk into one of them. There are 2 bedrooms, and there are 12 people from 3 families living there. There's lots of kids, teenagers, toddlers running in and out. I mean, it's very hot. I met a woman named Belkis, and she had just the worst stroke of luck. She showed up at the U.S. border seeking asylum the same week that Remain in Mexico came into effect here. And she told me that the Border Patrol essentially said to her, bad luck, you guys are going back to Mexico. Now, she's here with her 17-year-old son. He was targeted back home by the gang MS-13, and she told me, like, right now, my kid is a mess.
Creo que mi hijo adolescente es el que más ha sufrido en este viaje.
She said he's 17 years old, he's an adolescent, but he cries all the time like a little kid.
Oh, gosh. One of many people I gather you met, including one who has a court hearing today, is that right?
That's right. They're crossing over the border into El Paso today. So this is Joseph and Tanya. They're a family from Honduras. They have a little daughter with them. Tanya saw her parents murdered, again by members of a gang. She was incredibly brave. She testified against these people in court. The gang was furious. And Steve, they put a note on her door one day that said, and I quote, "You have 45 minutes to leave. Sincerely, MS-13." Sincerely, MS-13. So she took her family and she got out.
That is definitely the kind of, that's you have to believe that sincerity in that situation. I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. She is lucky because she has a lawyer. Many migrants don't, though. And some of these migrants have been stuck in Juarez for months, Steve, and they have just decided to give up. When I was at the shelter, I heard that dozens of people have gone home. I met a young guy who's 18 from Guatemala. His father lives in Oregon, so that's where he was headed.
Wow.
He shows up at the U.S. border. He gets back to Juarez, and his dad basically tells him, "Son, I think you got to give it up." Now, I will tell you something interesting about him, Steve. He didn't seem happy to be going home to Guatemala, but he was one of the few people I've talked to this entire trip who didn't break down crying when I interviewed him. He told me he's just going to get on a bus and go home.
You're telling me that most people do weep when they start talking.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for your reporting. We'll continue hearing you through the week. And Noel King. And stay with us here because we're going to continue our discussion. President Trump's push to get a citizenship question on the 2020 census has hit another setback even after the Supreme Court ruled that question must go.
The Trump administration, though, is still trying to get this done. If they're going to do it within the law, they need some new rationale, some new reasoning. So the Justice Department tried to change its entire legal team, new lawyers to make a new case. Yesterday, a federal judge in New York said no way.
NPR's Hansi Lo Wong covers all things census and joins us now from New York. Hansi, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
Why did the judge say no?
The judge called this request to withdraw these attorneys, quote, patently deficient, and he noted the administration provided no reason, let alone satisfactory reasons, which is what is required in order to change out lawyers here in this court in Manhattan. And he did allow 2 attorneys who, one has already left the Justice Department, one has left the Civil Division of the Justice Department to withdraw, but most of the attorneys are still on the case, and the Justice Department has declined to comment on this latest development.
Has the president responded to being stuck with the legal team whose strategy he did not like?
Yes, not surprisingly, he tweeted last night, and he called this judge, U.S. District Judge Jesse Furman, an Obama-appointed judge, and he said that this judge, quote, won't let the Justice Department use the lawyers that it wants to use. That's not what Judge Furman did here. He said that he is declining this request because the Justice Department did not provide a reason for withdrawing these attorneys.
Now, I guess we should mention we would normally not bother to spend people's time talking about the exact identities of various members of a legal team, but there seems to be something much larger at stake here. What is behind this effort to change lawyers?
That is a really good question, and that is also what is so unusual here. The Justice Department has not provided a reason to the public as well for this change, and I've talked to former Justice Department attorneys. They're concerned about what's happening here. Sam Alika-Friedland, a former career DOJ attorney, entered the service under President Obama, just left earlier this year under President Trump. This is what he told me.
To reassign a trial team at this stage in litigation is, to not put too fine of a point on it, insane. To sort of throw someone in the deep end at this point in any litigation this major causes massive disruption.
So I guess we don't know literally why they tried to change the team, but we do know they were trying to change the legal argument, right? They'd essentially lost before the Supreme Court. They had a very long shot opportunity to come up with some new rationale to squeeze a citizenship question on the census, and they needed lawyers who would try to make that case.
And former DOJ attorneys are telling me they are concerned that this is a sign that Justice Department attorneys are being pressured to possibly violate their ethical standards by making arguments going forward.
Hansi, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Hansi Lo Wang. All right, pressure is mounting for Labor Secretary Alex Acosta to resign. Here's Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer.
It is now impossible for anyone to have confidence in Secretary Acosta's ability to lead the Department of Labor. If he refuses to resign, President Trump should fire him.
Schumer is making that call because Acosta helped broker a plea deal for Jeffrey Epstein. Acosta was a federal prosecutor in Miami when Epstein, the billionaire, was first accused of sex crimes back in 2007. Now, Epstein ended up doing only 13 months in jail. He was also allowed to leave 6 days a week to go to work. He is now back in court on sex trafficking charges.
So how is his past affecting him now? NPR White House correspondent Franco Ordonez is covering this story. He's in our studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
So there's one guy who can fire Alex Acosta. What's he saying?
That's right. Well, right now, President Trump appears to be standing behind his Labor Secretary. Here is what he said yesterday when he was asked about it.
I feel very badly, actually, for Secretary Acosta because I've known him as being somebody that works so hard and has done such a good job. I feel very badly about that whole situation. But we're going to be looking at that and looking at it very closely.
You know, we've been here before where other top officials have fallen amid a drumbeat of calls to resign and sustain reporting. You can name Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price, Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. All these officials eventually resigned despite similar words of support from the president. There is a difference here. That alleged misconduct in those cases happened before the administration. In this case, with Acosta, it happened well before he joined the administration.
I guess we should also notice that in some ways this issue is personal for the president. He has a guy who's accused of doing something wrong in a case of sexual misconduct. The president has been accused of sexual misconduct. He has a guy who's been accused of doing something wrong in a case involving Jeffrey Epstein, who in the past was a friend of the president by the president's own account, and they spent a lot of time together. This is a case that the president has some involvement in.
Yeah, I mean, the president obviously has this history. He has the history with Epstein, and he is trying to back away from some of that. We heard that yesterday as well, despite the reporting and what we know about their relationship. He is now saying that they are no longer friends, that they had kind of a falling out.
Now, there is, as you pointed out, the fact that Alex Acosta did this plea deal long before he was labor secretary, years and years ago. But Senator Tim Kaine, Democratic senator, said it was an illegal plea deal. Is there any way to say that it is illegal?
Well, I mean, I think really it's going to be up to the courts to decide that. But earlier this year, a federal judge did rule that prosecutors had violated federal law when they did not tell victims about the plea deal. Because of that, the Justice Department said they're investigating allegations of professional misconduct by prosecutors in the case. The White House is also looking into this.
Is Alex Acosta himself just going about his job as labor secretary?
Not surprising. He's defending himself. He took to Twitter saying the outcome with Epstein was a good outcome. Epstein went to jail. He registered as a sexual offender. But obviously, Democrats want him to resign.
I guess it's a detail of Epstein going to jail that makes some people question this, because he did go to a facility, but wasn't he like 6 days a week allowed to leave and go to work during the day?
That's correct. He was able to leave.
Okay. Franco, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Franco Ordonez.
Secretary of Labor Alex Acosta is defending a plea deal that he oversaw nearly a dozen years ago as a U.S. attorney in Florida.
Yeah, that deal allowed the financier Jeffrey Epstein to avoid federal charges for sexually abusing young girls. In a press conference yesterday, Acosta said his office handled the case right.
I know that in 2019, looking back on 2008, things may look different. But this was the judgment of prosecutors with dozens of years of experience.
People started looking at that plea deal again when prosecutors in New York charged Epstein with sex trafficking last weekend.
We've got NPR's lead political editor, Domenico Montanaro, with us this morning. Hi, Domenico.
Good morning, Rachel.
So the Secretary of Labor, Alex Acosta, spoke for almost an hour yesterday. What else did he say?
Well, he said it was a difficult case and that Epstein was going to be essentially let off the hook if he didn't intervene. So let's listen to part of his justification.
There is a value to a sure guilty plea because letting him walk, letting what the state attorney was ready to do go forward would have been absolutely awful.
Now, Acosta said that he wasn't going to roll the dice on not getting a conviction. He wanted Epstein to go to jail. He wanted him to register as a sex offender, even though the sentence wound up being very light. And the man who was that Palm Beach County state attorney at the time is now saying that Acosta's recollection was completely wrong, that he had an indictment prepared but was abandoned after secret negotiations between Epstein's lawyers and Acosta. But it gets more tangled because in the big Miami Herald story on all this last year, you might remember the police involved at the time who were going after Epstein actually blamed that same Palm Beach County state attorney for pressuring them to downgrade the charges or drop the case altogether.
A tangled web, to be sure. So let's talk about the political implications of this. I mean, we know there's been a lot of pressure from Democrats pointing to Acosta and saying, you got to quit, putting pressure on the president to fire him. But the labor secretary has also had some critics on the right.
Well, yeah, I mean, there haven't been many on Capitol Hill, I'll say that. They've been mostly defending him and sticking by the president's line. But there have been reports that the president's chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, was unhappy with Acosta for not being more aggressive in dismantling some of these Obama-era workplace regulations. And Acosta dismissed that tension, though, yesterday, saying that Mulvaney told him to, quote, say that any talk of problems between them is, quote, BS.
So this is such a horrible story, really, when you sit and you read the details of it. And it makes you wonder if there's any political cost for the president. I mean, when there's such universal disgust with these allegations, does the president bear a political cost if he keeps Acosta around?
Well, look, he's the producer in chief. And, there was lots of reporting that he wanted Acosta to actually do this press conference to show that, that he could handle this. He didn't apologize to victims, and Trump doesn't like people who apologize. Vice President Mike Pence gave a kind of tepid statement afterward yesterday saying that he serves at the pleasure of the president, as do all the cabinet members. And we're in this odd situation where President Trump himself was friends with Jeffrey Epstein some years ago before he says they had a falling out. And it's notable that former President Bill Clinton did as well. So we'll see where any of this winds up going or if any of that sticks.
NPR's Domenico Montanaro. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, the British Navy is saying that it was able to stop an Iranian paramilitary vessel or vessels from blocking the passage of a British commercial ship in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, this is notable because there has been a lot going on in the Strait of Hormuz recently, including some attacks on oil tankers. It's a tense time between Iran and other world powers, especially the United States. President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear agreement last year, and he recently imposed new sanctions on Iran.
Right. So what does this latest alleged move by Iran mean for all of that? We've got Washington Post reporter Aaron Cunningham on the line with us from Dubai. Aaron, thanks for being with us.
Hi, thanks so much.
What more can you tell us about what happened?
Well, it's unclear exactly what happened, but what the British government is saying is that these Iranian vessels, there were 3 of them, they approached the tanker, the British Heritage, that had been in the Persian Gulf and was traveling through the Strait of Hormuz and attempted to stop it. Now, the tanker was being escorted by a British Navy ship, and so they were able to, that ship, that escort was able to signal to the Iranians that they should turn away, and they did, and it was able to pass safely after that. From the U.S. side, some U.S. officials were saying that the Iranians had attempted to seize the vessel, but it's just not clear that that's what happened. It may have been sort of, they wanted to, make a point, harass the ship in the waterway, and so that's where we stand right now.
Right, and this is not happening in a vacuum, obviously. As Noel alluded to, it's some level, this is all about the Iran nuclear deal and Iran continuing to agitate the United States, which pull out of the deal, but also trying to pressure the current signatories to the deal to live up to their end of the bargain and give Iran the financial benefits that it thinks it deserves. So how is this likely? I mean, this is a British tanker. How is it likely to change Britain's calculus on Iran and the nuclear deal?
I'm not entirely sure that it will. And with the United Kingdom, they've been sort of in the middle between the hardline U.S. position and sort of the softer European position that, has been emphasizing diplomacy and wants to sort of, keep Iran in the fray and within the deal. Now, the UK is committed to the nuclear agreement, and it has said that on multiple occasions, but it's also been a bit more forceful in condemning what it says are sort of malign Iranian activities in the Persian Gulf and in the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that you'll see sort of a harder line from the UK after this, but it's not clear that they will support, extra sanctions, for example, or if they will, scale back their own commitments under the nuclear deal as well.
Erin Cunningham from The Washington Post. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
One of the biggest teachers unions in this country is suing the U.S. Department of Education.
That's right. NPR obtained the complaint exclusively, and it alleges that a student loan forgiveness program is in such a shambles that it's actually illegal. Now, this program is supposed to forgive student loans for people who have worked 10 years in public service jobs. But for a lot of people, that is not what's happening.
NPR's Chris Arnold has been covering this story, uncovered it in the first place, and he's with us now. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Rachel.
So just tell us more about this suit. Who's filing it and why?
Well, the American Federation of Teachers is filing it, but this goes far beyond teachers. This involves the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which was created by Congress a decade ago. And it was created to encourage public service, so government and nonprofit work, that's police officers, nurses, Peace Corps volunteers, all kinds of jobs. Government may promise basically if you work for 10 years in public service and you make 10 years of loan payments, the government will forgive the rest of your federal student loans, which is like a great promise,
great,
right?
Yeah.
The problem is that only 1% of people who do this, they think they're on track, they do it for 10 years, they make all these payments, they go to get approved.
Yeah.
Only 1% get approved. Almost everybody's getting rejected.
So people who took certain jobs with the entire intention of getting their student debt erased after 10 years, they are not getting the help they thought they would.
Exactly. And we talked to Christopher Peterson. He's a former top attorney at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He says if you could get all of these people who are getting rejected into one place, basically you'd have,
football stadiums full of nurses, firefighters, teachers, law enforcement officers that are seeking to have their debts forgiven, having made all of these payments under the impression that they were on track and they're being turned away in droves.
So, that's pretty bad, and it's sparking a lot of outcry and a bunch of lawsuits.
Well, what's the justification? I mean, why aren't those loans getting forgiven?
Well, one big problem is that to get loan forgiveness, things get a little complicated, and you have to be in the right type of federal loan and the right type of repayment plan. And people are saying that, well, look, I called my loan servicing company. I called that 800 number on my statement, and I got bad information. They never told me I needed to change it to this kind of loan. And then 10 years later, they find out, oops, oh, sorry, nothing we can do now. We talked to Debbie Baker, who's a music teacher in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This happened to her. She says she got stuck with $76,000 that she thought was about to be forgiven.
And when this hit, I didn't know whether to cry, throw up, get mad. I just didn't know what to do. I honestly did not think the federal government would do this to someone.
So what happens to someone like Debbie? I mean, is this lawsuit now going to make a difference for her and her debt?
Well, she's a plaintiff, so quite possibly, who knows? But for everybody else, the lawsuit's trying to get the Ed Department to come up with an appeals process that could work for lots and lots of people. We should say that the Department of Education recently implemented a dramatic fix to a different program, which we reported on, the Teach Grant program. And that now is returning grant money to thousands of people who had grants taken away unfairly. So fixes are possible.
Is the Department of Education saying anything about this?
So far, the lawsuit's just being filed this morning, that they don't have a comment yet.
All right, NPR's Chris Arnold for us this morning on this lawsuit against the Department of Education. Chris, thanks. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
What does the president do after failing to change the 2020 census?
The president gave up a bid to add a question about citizenship on the census. Experts said it would have generated an inaccurate count of immigrants. A Republican operative who was part of the effort to add the citizenship question had explicitly written that adding the question would benefit Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. Courts rejected the move at every turn. As the president acknowledged defeat, though, he also said he wasn't giving up. He was going to try another way. He ordered the federal government to collect citizenship data through existing databases.
With today's order, we will collect all of the information we need to conduct an accurate census and to make responsible decisions about public policy, voting rights, and representation in Congress.
Representation in Congress. So the president said explicitly that his move could allow states to redraw congressional districts in a way that experts say could benefit his political party.
NPR's Hansi-Lo Wong has been covering the census story from the beginning. Hansi, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
So how else can the administration gather citizenship information other than asking people through the census?
Well, there are existing records about citizenship that the government can compile and gather from various federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Social Security Administration, and the State Department.
So are they doing anything new as a result of this executive order?
You know, I can't see what this new executive order, what impact will be new in this front, because last year, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who approved adding the citizenship question, he already ordered the Census Bureau to start compiling those records. And so this is something that's already happening. And the Census Bureau said as of May, they're ready to release that information anonymized without identifying individuals. They're just waiting for guidance from the Commerce Secretary.
Okay, trying to figure out then how significant this is. There's maybe less to this order than meets the eye because it was already being done, and yet it is being done for the purpose that the president laid out. And some people may wonder what would be wrong if states were to go along with the president's suggestion that they can reshape their congressional districts knowing who is a citizen without really including non-citizens.
Right. Well, this is a topic that really is kind of in a legal gray area. It's really ripe for a Supreme Court battle coming up. Once a state or locality passes some law that says this is how they're going to do redistricting. And but what's interesting, though, is that the challengers of the citizenship question, they made this allegation that this was indeed the true intention of the Trump administration. That's why they pushed for this question, to give Republicans and non-Hispanic white people a political advantage when redistricting comes along. The Trump administration up until now has denied that. And so President Trump is now saying this is the reason, one of the reasons why citizenship information is important.
Is this constitutional?
This is, again, something that will be tested in the courts if it is done, if any state or locality tries to do this.
Let me figure out what the argument would be then, why it would not be constitutional. The census has something, the Constitution has something about the census counting everyone, right? And it is presumed that that is the way that the districts would be drawn, is from the census, not through some other count of some subset of people. Is that it?
Well, the Constitution requires a count of every person living in the country, and there's another federal law that requires one person, one vote as a standard, and it is unclear right now exactly how the courts will rule if you were to consider that just voter-eligible citizens.
Okay, so just another phase in a long-running battle. Hansi, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
NPR's Hansi-Lo Wong. Tropical Storm Barry is arriving this weekend in Louisiana.
The storm is currently over the northern Gulf of Mexico. The winds aren't really strong enough for it to be labeled a hurricane at this point, but the rain that the storm brings could be devastating.
NPR's Debbie Elliott is in New Orleans, where preparations are underway, a city that's suffered so much. Hi there, Debbie.
Good morning.
What are things like today?
Well, it's very breezy. There have been occasional, strong gusts of winds and some scattered showers as Barry gets a little closer. And generally, there's just this feeling in the air that humid feeling that lets you know that the tropics are engaged and something's coming.
I just want to remember the geography of New Orleans when we think about, I guess forecasters are talking about as many as 25 inches of rain in some places. I guess we should remember lots of New Orleans is below sea level, right? And they've got pumps to pump the water out. But the question is, does it rain faster than they can get the water out of there?
It does, and it's already very wet. Earlier this week, heavy rain inundated the city and kind of crippled parts of it. And so the city is already saturated. It's like a big bowl that's basically surrounded by water. Mayor LaToya Cantrell says the city's pumps are running at optimal levels. There are no problems there, but she says that might not be enough.
Well,
we cannot pump our way out of the water levels and the waterfalls that are expected to hit the city of New Orleans.
And Steve, this is going to be a slow-moving soaker. The rain could persist for like 48 hours. So far, the mayor has not ordered any evacuations here in New Orleans. She says people should be ready to have a plan and be ready to shelter in place.
So individuals are being told to be ready to shelter in place, keep some food on hand, keep some clean water on hand in case you get tons of not-so-clean water coming your way. What are state and federal officials doing to prepare, though?
Well, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards has gotten a federal disaster declaration that sort of frees up federal resources to get in place. He's expecting widespread impact statewide, not just New Orleans, also Baton Rouge, Lafayette, other places. He's activated National Guard troops who are positioning what they need for the rescue and response efforts, things like high water vehicles and emergency provisions. There have also been mandatory evacuations in places that are, outside of the levee systems. For instance, Grand Isle on the coast, parts of Plaquemines and Jefferson parishes, places that are particularly vulnerable down on, close to waterways and close to the Gulf of Mexico. We should also note this is disrupting industry. Offshore oil and gas are affected. More than 200 platforms and rigs have been evacuated and production halted. That means about half of the oil and natural gas that's produced in the Gulf of Mexico has been curtailed.
Well, appreciate the reminder you don't need to be below sea level in New Orleans to potentially be affected by a couple feet of rain.
Right. And I should remind people that there's this other problem, and that is the Mississippi River is already in flood. So it's already at this record high level. Now this storm surge coming up is really going to test the new levee system here.
Oh, gosh. And everything, of course, that drains out of Louisiana is going to end up in that river. Debbie, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
NPR's Debbie Elliott. The R&B singer R. Kelly is in federal custody.
Yeah, he was arrested last night in Chicago on federal charges, which include child pornography and obstruction of justice. R. Kelly, for years, had been accused of sexual misconduct involving minors. He was already out on bond, facing multiple state charges. But these federal charges represent yet another escalation in the sex abuse cases against him.
So what kind of escalation? Let's ask Patrick Smith of our member station WBEZ. Good morning.
Morning.
How do these charges differ from the state charges, if at all?
Well, we don't know a lot of details yet about the federal charges. We know it's a 13-count indictment that was handed down by a federal grand jury yesterday here in Chicago. What we do know is that this is an escalation. Originally the state charges were filed in February. Then in May, some of those charges were upgraded to Class X felonies, which are the most serious charges R. Kelly has ever faced. And now these new federal charges represent a sort of whole new ballgame when it comes to the legal troubles for R. Kelly.
What were the underlying acts that caused Cook County prosecutors in Cook County in Chicago to bring the state charges?
So Kelly is accused of sexual abuse and sexual assault of 4 different women, 3 of whom were minors at the time of the alleged abuse. I don't want to go into too much detail there, but there are 4 separate cases for the 4 alleged victims. Each one alleged multiple sex acts, and that was part of the new charges that came up in May, which was R. Kelly was accused of forcible sexual assault as opposed to the statutory rape that he was accused of previously.
Well, now you mentioned 4. I guess over time, R. Kelly had been accused of abusing far more than 4 women, right? I mean, this is a long-running accusation against R. Kelly. I suppose one question is whether the federal charges will bring in more victims.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest outstanding questions. You know, in 2008, he was found not guilty by a jury here in Chicago of making child pornography. And since then, there have been, many alleged victims who have come forward who say that he sexually assaulted or abused them. You know, all of the state charges that are outstanding right now that we're waiting on trial for, those are all pretty old, at least 10 years old. So one thing I'm waiting to see with this new indictment is, are there any more recent acts that are being alleged in these new federal charges? You know, it's hard to prove cases that are really old. R. Kelly's attorneys have even said that they think the statute of limitations may be up on some of these, although legal experts I talked to disagree. So it'll be interesting to see with these federal charges if there are new victims and if they're more recent.
How much has this case dominated conversation in Chicago? I'm curious, when people find out that this is what you've been covering for a while, do they just have a lot of questions?
It is a really big topic of conversation here in Chicago, although in ways both good and bad, Chicago is a really big news town, so I can't say it's been the only thing, but it's something that is on a lot of people's minds here in Chicago. And there are a lot of supporters of R. Kelly here in Chicago. You know, almost every court day that I go to, there are supporters of his there in the courtroom and outside of the courthouse.
And so that could very well be the case again as we learn more about these federal charges, I guess.
Exactly.
Patrick, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's Patrick Smith of WBEZ in Chicago on the federal charges we're learning about against R. Kelly.
So this has happened before. A news story unfolds that doesn't directly involve President Trump. And then the president lets loose with radioactive comments that recenter the news story around him.
In this case, House Democrats had been arguing. 4 newly elected women were debating their speaker, Nancy Pelosi, over how to confront the president. And then the president wrote on Twitter saying that progressive Democratic women should, quote, go back to clean up the, quote, crime-infested places from which they came. Needless to say, all American lawmakers are United States citizens, and nearly all were born in the United States. Democratic Representative Ben Ray Lujan responded on Fox News.
That's a racist tweet. Telling people to go back where they came from? These are American citizens elected by voters in the United States of America to serve in one of the most distinguished bodies in the U.S. House of Representatives. I think that's wrong.
NPR's Franco Ordonez, who covers the White House, is in studio with us this morning. Hi, Franco.
Hi.
All right, so who was the president talking about in these tweets?
Well, I mean, he didn't name names, but it's widely felt that he was referring to 4 Democratic freshman lawmakers, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Representative Rashida Tlaib, and Representative Ayanna Pressley. They had been in the news for pressure that you mentioned that they had been putting on their own party leaders.
And not to put too fine a point on it, but these women are citizens, and 3 of them were born here in the United States. Yeah?
Yep, I mean, right. President Trump seems to be ignoring that fact. Only Omar was not born in the country. She's from Somalia, but Pressley, she was born in Cincinnati. Tlaib, she was born in Detroit. Ocasio-Cortez, she's from New York. She was born in the Bronx.
So the president interjecting himself into a fight among Democrats. What are Democrats saying about what he tweeted out?
They're responding strongly. You played the clip. Some are calling for Trump's impeachment. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she says the slogan, Make America Great Again, is really about, or always has been about, Make America White Again. Those are her words. It's also interesting because Trump may be the one to kind of end a skirmish between Pelosi and these same lawmakers. The 4 clashed over a border package. Pelosi questioned their influence. Ocasio-Cortez hit back, saying they're singling out women of color. It's been a difficult couple of weeks.
Okay, so Democrats not holding back. What about Republicans?
Republicans have remained largely silent, which has been the case in the past when Trump has kind of come under this kind of scrutiny about possible racism comments. But Trump himself, he's not backing down. He tweeted again last night, questioned why Democrats would defend these lawmakers. He also welcomed this issue becoming one at the ballot box.
Let me ask you about something semi-adjacent to all of this because it does involve immigration. The Trump administration is trying to make deals with some countries in Central America where a lot of migrants are coming from. It happened with Mexico. People are now remaining in Mexico for their day in U.S. immigration court. Now the president's trying this with Guatemala. What's happening there?
So the Trump administration is trying to reach an agreement with the government of Guatemala where migrants on their way to the United States could stop in Guatemala and apply for their asylum and kind of stay there while their asylum claims are processed. Local opposition has been swift. The Guatemalan government has said that it wants to reschedule this meeting that it was going to have starting today. But it's a big blow for the Trump administration because one of Trump's strategies has been reducing immigration levels, and this was part of that plan.
And as with Remain in Mexico, it does appear to be working. NPR's Franco Ordonez, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, so over the weekend, we expected to see the mass arrest of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, the Trump administration teased for weeks operations by Immigration and Customs Enforcement across at least 10 cities. The president said these operations would begin on Sunday. Many leaders in those cities and immigrant communities, and as well as protesters, were ready to fight back. So the protesters were out, but Sunday, the promised day of action, came and went with very little action.
NPR's John Burnett covers immigration. He's on the line now from Austin. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Noelle.
So I want to ask you what did happen this weekend, but maybe the better question is what didn't happen this weekend?
Exactly. We've heard about very few arrests so far. We were told to expect that ICE agents would be conducting targeted enforcement operations against migrants who have an outstanding deportation order. And ICE hates the term raids. They say these are not random roundups. Rather, they're targeting migrants who crossed the southern border recently. Their cases were expedited. A judge turned down their asylum request, and now they're movable. Immigrant advocates have been telling migrants all week, you don't have to open the door to ICE agents unless agents have an administrative warrant, which they usually don't have.
And we did hear stories over the weekend of some people just not opening the doors. I mean, John, it's pretty unusual to telegraph immigration raids or roundups in a big public manner the way the president did, because it just makes them harder to pull off, right? So do you think that's the reason this was much smaller than we expected?
Well, it's hard to say because law enforcement doesn't generally inform the world they're about to come arrest you, and we're not sure this thing is actually launched yet. It was President Trump who announced this deal to let his supporters know that his crackdown on unauthorized migrants is still going strong. The problem with this operation, Noelle, is that agents hate going door to door because it can be such a waste of time. It's labor intensive. The immigrant is often not there. They say it's dangerous for the agents. And even if the target is there, as the lawyers tell them, they don't have to open the door. WNYC talked to an eyewitness who said 3 ICE agents showed up at the locked entrance to an apartment building in Brooklyn on Saturday morning in search of one of these deportable immigrants. And they were shouting, open the door, but no one did, and so they went away. ICE prefers to arrest migrants already in custody at a county jail or coming out of a courtroom.
You know, of course, that ICE has been aggressively arresting immigrants since President Trump came into office. So what about this operation struck such a chord?
Well, I mean, this operation has been so controversial because it's families. Most with no criminal convictions. All these are families who've been crossing the border seeking asylum. Trump wants to send a message that you can't just skip court, dissolve into the country, and live here indefinitely. He wants to scare off the migrants who are thinking about coming north. And apprehending immigrant families can be complicated. I mean, mom and dad can be here illegally, and their children can all be U.S. citizens. And if you arrest the parents, what do you do with the kids? So expect pictures on social media of the children being marched into ICE vans along with their parents.
And John, just to be clear, just because it didn't happen en masse over the weekend doesn't mean we shouldn't still expect roundups, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Just because the raids didn't start yesterday, it doesn't mean they're not going to get rolling later this week. Immigration lawyers do tell us that they'll be closely monitoring ICE arrests, and there will be people out in the neighborhoods watching, and they're ready to help migrant families who are headed for deportation.
NPR's John Burnett in Austin. Thanks, John.
You're welcome.
All right, in Puerto Rico, a lot of people are calling on the governor to resign.
Yeah, these calls for Governor Ricardo Rosselló to step down come after local media published leaked messages in which he and top advisors engage in misogynistic and often offensive exchanges. Demonstrators have been surrounding the governor's residence since Saturday, and many leaders of the governor's own party have abandoned him.
Adrian Florido from NPR's Code Switch team is on the line from San Juan. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Noel.
So let's talk about these messages. Misogynistic, offensive. Where did they come from and what exactly was going on? Who was saying what?
Well, they came from a private group chat that the governor and several members of his cabinet and closest advisors used to communicate over the course of several months, late last year, early this year. And a few days ago, someone within started leaking them page by page. And then on Saturday, Puerto Rico's Center for Investigative Journalism obtained and published all 900 pages. Ooh. And they're pretty bad. In one instance, the governor calls the ex-speaker of the New York City Council a really offensive, misogynistic word that starts with WH. They insult journalists. They talk about discrediting the work of a federal police monitor. One of his advisors even makes a joke about the dead bodies that were piling up at a government facility before and after Hurricane Maria.
Oh my God.
And there are 900 pages of this stuff.
All right, so Puerto Rico's governor was already in trouble before these messages leaked, right? I mean, he's been dealing with a corruption scandal. Can you explain what's happening there?
Right, and it didn't directly implicate him, but a few days earlier, the FBI had arrested a couple of his recently departed top officials and filed corruption charges against them, accusing them of steering contracts, lucrative federal contracts, to friends or businessmen with political connections. And this was a big stain on the governor's reputation because he has made a big point of trying to project this image of transparency and a competent administration, especially since President Trump, as we know, has repeatedly accused Puerto Rican officials of being corrupt. So as a justification for trying to withhold money that Puerto Rico still needs to recover from Hurricane Maria. So it's really been kind of one black eye after another for the governor this week.
Yeah, so how are Puerto Ricans reacting to all of this?
Oh, they're furious and they're embarrassed. Pretty much everyone agrees that this is the biggest political crisis in Puerto Rico's modern history. Everyday Puerto Ricans have been showing up to the governor's mansion, as you mentioned earlier. His political opponents have jumped on this. But even within his own party, his supporters have mostly abandoned him. They're either saying that he should not run for re-election in 2020, and a lot have also just called for his outright resignation. But the governor has said no. He said he's staying. He's not going anywhere.
Okay, so he's refusing. So what are the next steps for people who want him out? Do they just have to wait till re-election in 2020?
Well, there has been talk within the legislature of beginning removal proceedings to take him out of the governor's mansion, but it's still not clear whether that's going to happen. There are also a lot of well-sourced journalists here who yesterday started basically talking about, hey, there might actually be other text message chats, and so if that stuff comes out, it could be pretty embarrassing, and who knows what will happen then.
Ish. NPR's Adrian Florido. Thanks so much, Adrian.
No, thanks, Noah.
This is NPR News.
On the next Fresh Air, a wide-ranging discussion about TV with Emily Nussbaum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning TV critic for The New Yorker.